Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senior Analyst at Forrester, Ryan Skinner.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. As I said, my name is Ryan Skinner. I'm a senior analyst at Forrester Research. I typically work in London, but it's a real delight to be here for this Conductor event. For those of you who don't know Forrester, we're a research and advisory company that advises marketing leaders and digital leaders on how to win, serve, and retain customers. So the name of my presentation today is Marketing's Customer Obsession Imperative. Now, typically, when Forrester analysts are asked to present, because we work in research, because we work in data, and we're analysts, we're expected to share some data. So I'm going to share a data point. There you go. There's my data point, less than 20. What is less than 20? Less than 20 is the average age in years of all the companies in the S&P 500. The S&P 500, the 500 largest companies traded by market capitalization. Just 20 years. If you zoom across to the UK, it's about the same story. Same accelerating mortality rate. If you look in the UK, the FTSE 100 back in 1984, in 2012, of those 100 largest companies, only 24 were still trading. Were still in business. If you look at this data over time, you zoom back to the 20s, the average age of a business was about 70 years on the S&P 500. With some cyclical variations, that has just steadily decreased and decreased and decreased year after year. Until now, it's less than 20 years. That is the average age. It's not the amount of time that they've spent in the S&P 500, an average of 20 years. That is the average age of all the companies. So for every one of those 100-year-old mammoth aging veteran companies, there's like 5, 10, 50 companies that are just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. This is evolution writ large. Now, the causes of this accelerating mortality rate, we have mergers and acquisitions, we have liquidations, we have bankruptcies. Many different ways that businesses are losing their relevance. A lot of the mergers and acquisitions, present company notwithstanding, are structural declines and acquisition by businesses that are growing faster than them. So what we're seeing is that there's this common denominator, which is losing relevance in the market. So I ask you, what defines relevance? Or better yet, who defines relevance? Well, I'm going to share, before I answer that question for you, I'm going to share two interesting examples that are kind of mileposts, potentially, on the path towards irrelevance for businesses. So, first example, Exhibit A, Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo was in the news quite a bit about 18 months ago, when it turned out that a number of their account and salespeople were selling accounts, in fact, sold accounts to about 3 million plus of their customers that their customers didn't know about. Those customers were given deposit accounts, they were given insurance accounts, they started paying account fees for these that they didn't even know about. Right? Wells Fargo got a lot of bad attention for this, a lot of legislative troubles, a lot of regulatory troubles. As I was looking for that logo, I came across this one. Together we'll go far, which immediately raises a few questions. Who in this story is we, right? And with whose money are we going somewhere? And where are we going? And is there a jail there, right? This is one interesting example. Let's call this failure to prioritize customers. Second example is very different. Budweiser, king of beers. As it turns out, Budweiser is no longer the king of beers. It's not the queen of beers. It's not the prince or princess of beers. It's like the duke of beers or the earl of beers or the viscount of beers. They announced earlier this year that they were no longer the third most sold major lager. They're now the fourth and have steadily been decreasing in market share. Budweiser is one of these brands. All of them, actually, many of these large brands are in decline. They're not adapting to the tastes of their customers. Their customers are increasingly preferring smaller, niche, special interest types of lagers, craft beers, and different offerings. Many of these businesses are failing to adapt quickly enough to how their customers want to engage with their businesses. Let's call this failure to understand customers. We are in a massive economic evolutionary period right now, where everything is changing. Who defines relevance? Who determines relevance? It's the customer. Customers and the increasing customer power is changing the whole equation for how businesses need to operate. In fact, this is changing all kinds of areas of business. In fact, just the way that businesses are now valued comes back to customers. Very interesting knock-on effects are happening throughout industry. One interesting area that we're seeing that happen is within the accounting space. So about 18 months ago, there was an accounting study where they tried to determine how the largest companies in the US were valued. What was the actual source of the value of these large businesses? And as it turned out, the lion's share of that value was in intellectual property, goodwill, CX, brand, and reputation. Was 87% of the book value of these businesses. We're not talking about factories, trucks, machines, materials, things. We're talking about the thoughts and feelings of people, of their customers, of the market. Imagine that, how much value is sitting in that kind of non-concrete place, how strong the value of the customers are. Now, we at Forrester have been tracking this over a number of years. We've defined what we call this period the age of the customer. We started talking about this about 4 or 5 years ago. We backdated the beginning of this period really to around 2010. We said at that point that from around 2010, the real competitive differentiation for businesses, that is the thing that was going to separate them from their competitors more than any other thing, was going to be the degree to which they obsessed over their customers. You go back in history, look at a few prior eras. There was the age of manufacturing, right? The assembly line, Henry Ford assembly line. That was a key differentiation. Put a lot of ma and pa shops out of business. That was a key competitive advantage for businesses in that era. Then the age of distribution, the age of the global supply chain. So all the businesses that were going to succeed in that era had to be very good at manufacturing, but they also had to have a truly lean global supply chain. Then we move on to the age of information. Again, there's all those things that came before that had just become table stakes. Now it was all about having the right information at the right time to make key and crucial decisions. We saw the rise of businesses like Amazon, Capital One, the ability to apply data science. Was truly transformational and key in the age of information. Now, in this era, all those things have become table stakes. You have to have those just to be in the game. But to have a competitive advantage, you have to obsess over your customers. Really understand them and serve them. And the businesses that are succeeding at doing that, businesses like Amazon, like Salesforce, USAA, are able to do this. Obsess over the customers and deliver value off the back of it. It's not just about being what you might call customer-centric. This kind of awareness that there are customers out there. We say this language of being customer-obsessed is crucial. We define a customer-obsessed enterprise as one which focuses its strategy, its operations, and its budget to enhance the knowledge of and engagement with customers. What this really means is that when faced with any key decision, everyone in the business, from the CEO all the way down to the lowliest clerk, will make that decision in the best interest of the customers against all other competing priorities. As we know in business, there's a lot of other different priorities. As you can see, that clearly wasn't the case at Wells Fargo. This is a very important fact, but one of the questions that comes up when we start talking about this issue of being customer obsessed is this feasible? Is it advisable? Are we actually going to maintain or establish that real economic advantage? We looked into it, and not only is it feasible, not only is it advisable, it's imperative if you want to drive growth. What we did is we developed what we call a customer experience index. Now, this is essentially an index where we pull a lot of different business data, transactional data, customer data to establish a score for hundreds of, actually thousands of businesses around the world now, to establish between 0 and 100 how customer obsessed they are. If you're at 100, you're extremely customer obsessed. If you're at 0, you're not customer obsessed at all. You're customer ignorant. I don't know how you define that, something along those lines. And against these, we define perennial. We've been doing this for about 6 or 7 years. And against this index, we've defined businesses that are perennial, year after year leaders, and businesses that are year after year laggards, and compared them one to the other. And what we found is that in general, across almost every category, those businesses that were leaders were growing their revenue at about 5x of the laggards. They were truly growing past and accelerating beyond their competitors because of this. It's interesting to note there was one exception to businesses having this advantage based on customer obsession. That was a scenario where there was customer lock-in, right? If you have a monopoly, you can treat your customers like crap, and they're not going to run away. You're not going to not outperform your competitors, right? It's like, do you want water? In every other business, if you don't have complete customer lock-in, this is going to be the crucial differentiation. Not only were we doing that, we were also trying to establish for marketers and customer leaders, what did this mean to change your customer obsession? What would that mean in the bottom line? How were we going to grow off the back of this? How could we scale our business or understand our business using this idea of customer obsession? So what we did is we established a few key values. We know that there are key values that come out of customer experience. There's a retention value, the degree to which a customer stays with the business. There's an enrichment value, that is how much more they spend with us over time. There's an advocacy value, that is the degree to which they become a walking advertisement for us. And against these three values, we looked across a number of different industries, and we could say, okay, we know and we have defined that based upon just a 1-point increase in that customer experience index, that creates for each customer this much more average value across the business. You multiply that times the number of customers a business will typically support in the course of a year for large enterprises, and that gives you kind of a year-on-year delta. What is the annual difference? So we calculated that across a number of different verticals. Auto manufacturers in the mass market have the most to gain. Hotels, upscale hotels, over $300 million to be gained from having a 1-point increase in their customer experience index. If they make their customers just that little bit more effective at relating with them, or making it that much easier to do business with them, or make their perception of doing that business more emotional in a positive way, or at least a little less negative, it'll have that kind of value to the business. This has been helping. We've been using this to try to help our clients make a case for changing how they relate to their customers, changing how they build their business and think about it, and become more customer obsessed. So we see a material connection between customer obsession and business success. Now there's a second part of this story. The second part of this story is that the customers are changing. The customers' habits and how they relate to businesses is changing over time. And we've been tracking that too. We have a front row seat to that. We've been surveying customers about their relationships to business, their relationships to channels, devices, a lot of different issues about how they relate to their transactions for a decade. Thousands and thousands and thousands of customers around the world. And we've identified the rise of what we call a segment of empowered customers. We see these people changing in kind of 5 key kinds of ways. One of the ways that we see a lot of change in the whole customer base is willingness to experiment, especially in kind of a commercial kind of context. So what does this mean? Forrester's, we talk about this idea of hyper-adoption, that people increasingly are more and more willing to try out new things much quicker and adopt and start using them much quicker. So for example, we tracked the rate of adoption of MP3 players, a little over a decade ago. Actually, now 2 decades ago. Then we tracked the rate of adoption of tablets about a decade ago. And the rate of adoption of tablets was much, much faster. The customers have become more aware of grabbing and starting to use new technology and getting value from it, and hesitating less. And I think when we look at the adoption of in-house assistants, the Alexas, HomePods, things of that nature, we'll see that that was adopted even quicker. And that's really crazy. I mean, these devices, it's like having an employee of Amazon in your house. That's remarkable. The fact that people are not hesitating to bring that in and start interacting with it and relating to it, and the speed with which that happens. The empowered customers are more and more willing to experiment with new technology and try it out. Second aspect, we see more and more of this digital-physical integration, right? It's no longer that it's a digital interaction or a physical interaction. We see that 1 out of every 2 customers will regularly take their mobile phone out while they're shopping to get some information, to check prices, to read reviews. There's just no one phase. You're in both phases all the time. Third aspect that we saw was just device usage, right? More and more internet-connected devices around us. The average household we find has something like 3 to 4 connected devices. I'm imagining many in this room are probably like 3 to 4. Are you kidding me? A dozen more. There's more and more devices, more and more ways to relate to that information, get it quicker, and start using it. The fourth way we see people changing is information savviness. Consumers tell us for about at least 40% of their purchases, they're going to multiple sources of information to find out how to relate to a purchase. They're using more and more kind of source critique and trying to understand different sources and what that means for a particular transaction. And the fifth area is this interesting area of self-efficacy. I find this one particularly interesting. So for example, 20% of consumers told us that they'll choose a product that satisfies them emotionally over a product that might have price or feature benefits. It's like, this product is better, it has features that are more suitable, but this one satisfies me more emotionally for different reasons, and thus I'll take that one. Maybe I actually feel like a Budweiser, but I'll go for the craft beer. Somehow it relates to me better. But it's an interesting aspect, how our consumers are changing and what that means. And marketers aren't really adapting to this. In fact, if you look at how marketers have adapted over recent history, we've kind of seen 3 ages, right? We go back to the age of manufacturing, age of distribution. This was truly the age of mass marketing. Getting messages out with the recency and frequency needed to lodge a particular message in people's head and drive that through the market. That worked quite well for a long time. Then, when we head into the age of information, we headed into the period of digital marketing. Then everything came down to driving great direct response campaigns, driving those clicks. We all became conversion junkies. But now we need to transition into the age of the customer. Marketers need to really become the drivers of customer obsession in their business. They need to be responsible for those business growth figures that we demonstrated can be established across all these different industries. Right now, marketers aren't there. So we talk to about 1,000 or survey about 1,000 marketers around the globe every year, and we ask them, does your marketing function have primary responsibility for customer experience? As you see here, it's about 20-odd%, something like that. Or 20, actually more like 30%. 70% don't have primary responsibility for the customer experience, which is astonishing, given how much value this has in the business, given how much focus this has for the business, and given how much future value this creates. Now, one of the questions that I had immediately was, well, maybe it's the case that in so many of these businesses there's a dedicated customer experience function that's executing on that vision. Not so. That's about 5-10%. When the rest of those businesses, it's between operations, sales, customer service, a number of other different areas. Marketing really needs to own this. So what does owning it mean? What does owning customer experience mean? We talk about 4 significant dynamic shifts. The first shift is going from being customer aware to being customer-led. Being customer-led means we do it because it's in the best interests of the customer. The second is going from being data-rich to being insights-driven. We're trying to learn, to understand, to get under the skin of our customers as opposed to just trying to pull data to exploit them. The third piece is going from perfect to fast. I'll share an interesting example in a moment of a business that moved to fast in a way that wasn't necessarily perfect, but was at the pace of their customers. Because increasingly, just like our customers, we have to stumble along at a rate. And it doesn't have to look perfect because none of us are perfect, but we have to be at least relevant. And to be relevant for consumers means something different from what we've typically been doing in the past. The last piece is going from being siloed to being connected, having those different elements work together, working across the silos or working across the different channels or product groups or teams that we typically work across. These are these four kind of major transitions that marketers and businesses need to go through to get towards the scenario of being customer obsessed. This means a lot more than just changing a few budgets, shifting a few aspects. It's really about moving beyond the advertising-focused picture that many marketers have had to one of delivering these customer-obsessed experiences. This is hard. Businesses really struggle with this. We spend lots of time working with businesses trying to get them up to speed, to get them there. One of the more interesting conversations that I had recently about this was with the global head of digital marketing and customer obsession at Philips, David Greenfield. He'd just gone there from Adidas and prior to that Mondelez. He's seen this happen. He's been working on it and driving it. He told me without the company culture, vision, and willingness to relook some very core fundamentals, these changes will be very short-lived or faked. It's really about changing the infrastructure, the foundations upon which marketing is built, how we think. So at Forrester, one of the ways that we try to do that and bring value to our customers is through what we call the customer lifecycle. It's not a revolutionary, it's a 6-phase customer lifecycle, but the thinking is constantly focusing on the customer's perception. How are they seeing the world? What are they trying to accomplish? How are they thinking? The 6 phases are discovery, exploration, purchase, using, asking, and engaging. Our marketing teams work with this foundation, this framework. Our enterprise architecture research teams work with this framework, infrastructure and operations. Even the guys who are super geeks on server virtualization use this framework for how they think about their work. A customer-centered, that customer perspective informs all of their activities. So I told you I'd share some interesting examples of some businesses that are starting to kind of act on this new way of thinking. One business that we see is one of those perennial customer experience leaders in the UK is a business called John Lewis. John Lewis is a bit like a British version of a Macy's or something like that. Slightly upscale department store type of experience. And they've really delivered on this. And one of the things that they've done very well is to really spend a lot of time on those customer journeys. Mapping them out, talking them through what is important to our customers, how do we differentiate. So they looked across 5 of their key journeys, 28 different key touch points, and they said, let's do a little bit of triage here. We can't make everything mind-blowingly, perfectly fantastic, but what we can do is make sure that across everything, we're at least on par with our competitors. We're never going to be worse in the journey than any of our competitors. Then in a few scenarios, which is important to John Lewis, maybe the delivery of appliances at the home or something along those lines, we want to be differentiated. We want to make sure that we're a little bit better than just about everybody. Or if not, at least on par with the very best. And then there was just like a few key scenarios where John Lewis would say, with this, we have to really lead the market. It has to be one of those remarkable kinds of experiences. And so that led to just a number of different types of content executions, some of them more complex than others, some of them quite simple. But none of their competitors were doing it. One of the things was like click and collect, making sure that they had a picture of the most relevant, close place to do the collection of an item that somebody had ordered. in the email, which was confirming it for them, because they recognized that that was where the people were going to see where the item was. So having a map there, so it was easy for them to find it. Things like that. Simple kinds of thinking. Making this leading the market kind of activity is also quite interesting, because if you remember, I was talking about those three kinds of value. I talked about retention value, enrichment value, and advocacy value. And one of the things that's interesting about these three values is that for those businesses at the bottom of the customer experience index, it's retention and enrichment are all the value. You increase a point, you get a lot more retention and enrichment. You don't get a lot of advocacy, right? If you go from a crap experience to a experience, people aren't going to go around raving about you, right? But they might come back and shop again. But for those businesses like John Lewis at the top of their game, or close to it, I should say they're not even at excellent, they're still at good. There's a few businesses in the US and in Asia that are truly at excellent customer experience, but this is the top retailer in the UK, and they're still just at the very top of the kind of good range. But for them, creating it, when you get to the higher levels, then it's that advocacy value that is the real delta when you're moving up 1 point. Because going from good to great, suddenly then you get a lot of customers saying this is fantastic and raving about it to their friends and driving more value that way. Second example that I love, this is a German bank, ING DIBA, and they wanted to become great through simplicity. Their CEO said, I want a business strategy so simple it'll fit on a beer napkin, and there it is. Right? They ripped out like half of their product offering, slimmed it way down. They started hiring people to work in the bank who had no banking experience but had great service experience. They wanted people to have a good experience with the bank, with people who understood them and who could help figure things out for them, even if they didn't always understand themselves, but they were determined to help their customers. And they ripped and replaced like all their call scripts. They took out all that weird jargonish language and rewrote everything to make it simple and easy to understand. They re-engineered all their engagement systems to make the right kind of information available to people, easy to read off, easy to understand. One of the things that we found from our own research, communications that are understandable and clear is a top and industry agnostic driver of CX performance. Or as I like to say, plain words make us happy. Right? We like that. It makes our life easy. Last example, I told you we'd talk about fast. So I had a great conversation with a marketing leader at Henkel. Not all of you will know who Henkel is, but you might know who Schwarzkopf is. Schwarzkopf is a hair products company. They do kind of hair dyes and hair colors and all kinds of different shampoos and products like that. And they wanted to move faster, to understand their customers. So some of you might know, but I didn't, there's something called rainbow hair. It's a bit of a trend. It's a thing. Not only that, which is kind of cool, there's something called unicorn hair, which is even cooler. I'm going to get my daughter to do this. They found out about this quite quickly because they'd set up what they kind of called an early trend response system. They were doing lots of social listening, and they were working with key partners. This fellow here is the look of a hairstylist. He is, in fact, a hairstylist. And he worked with Schwarzkopf to help them see what was happening in this space, what was significant, what kinds of new requests were coming in, what was hip, new, different, and growing and trending. This kind of insight allowed them to move faster. They engineered everything around their product development, et cetera, to move faster off the back of this kind of information. Thus, they were able to develop new products and get them out in the market with new messaging, everything new, much, much faster than their competitors. A lot of these kinds of businesses, like the fashion business, the cosmetics business, a lot of the kind of drug and beauty types of products businesses, tremendous advantage to be gained from moving quickly. We've seen the same thing happen within Johnson & Johnson. They've been re-engineering the business to move faster, to move at the rate of their customers, how they want it. So what does this mean for marketers? What do we need to do? How do we change? What are the first kind of things we should be thinking about to start kind of embedding this thing? hacking it into our culture, hacking it into the business? Well, there's a few kind of key ways. Well, first of all, marketing really needs to take this idea of a customer experience vision by the horns. They need to either drive it or fully engage with it and say, this is an important priority for us. We're not just going to be thinking about that upfront little piece, driving out the advertisements. We need to be thinking about the whole experience with the business and using that as a leverage to drive the business. Second of all, embedding customer understanding at the strategic and tactical levels of the business. Creating more opportunities to get customer understanding and customer insights to different parts of the business and the operations so that they can proceed with that kind of knowledge and with that kind of understanding, and helping the business to leverage that and work off of it. Third of all, bringing customers as close as possible and as often as possible to the point of creation and decision making. Getting customers into, for example, a scenario of talking through those customer journeys and those visions. Starting to hear how they talk about it, how they think about it. Getting that qualitative and quantitative feedback to how they're going to relate to the business. And lastly, incorporating more the customer and or their voice in the marketing. One thing that I've found interesting recently in talking, we did some research on user-generated content. And I talked to a major fashion brand. They did handbags. They're quite high-end handbags brand. They, of course, do lots of studio photography. And they started to use a little bit more user-generated content. So just normal women in the street with one of their bags. And it was interesting to note they started to use it in just one particular context. And they said, well, we saw, an uptick. Everything just started performing a little bit better when we put some of that user-generated content in the mix. So then we tried it in another context. We went from the email newsletters to the product landing pages to a lot of the menus. Basically, almost in every circumstance we put that kind of imagery, everything started to perform better. And it came as a shock to them because it didn't feel like it was as good looking as their studio photography. It was a bit dirtier. It wasn't as, they had a very high-end prestige brand, yet this was performing much better for them. The customers were seeing themselves in it, and thus they were having more success with it. It's part of that shift, starting to see customers recognizing themselves in the business and empathizing with both, kind of empathy going both ways. This is what Forrester sees as the need to make that shift towards customer obsession, and marketing needing to own that shift. And that's what we've been spending lots of time talking to marketers about, talking to their digital teams about. How do those two groups start working together, get the common vision, and start working towards it? And with luck, we're going to make them all more and more successful with it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.